This interview is brought to you in association with Rabobank.
The New Zealand wine story continues to be one of expansion and success, and it's growing in an increasingly complex international market. This is reflected in the most recent Rabobank Wine Quarterly Report. Marc Soccio was one of the authors of the report, and he joins me now. Marc, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
So, Marc, the big picture, global wine. What's the overall trend? Continued growth?
Yeah, look, in terms of global consumption, the picture is relatively positive. We have, two real growth engines in the global wine market. One continues to be the US, and then the other one, which has really taken hold in the last 5 to 10 years, has been China. So they're really the two key drivers there. And look, the New Zealand wine industry has positioned itself very well. It has, as you said in your introduction, experienced strong growth over a number of years, but it remains one of the highest value wine producers around the world, and certainly a lot of what it's doing and how it's positioned itself has found favour in markets all around the world.
Anything in particular about that Kiwi recipe that you think's the most important?
Absolutely. Look, New Zealand wine industry has no choice but to centre itself around cooler climate, lighter, brighter wine styles, and they are trends that have really caught on globally on two levels. One is those wines tend to be higher value in the market, and what we've seen around the world, you would also see it in the New Zealand market to a certain extent. As these markets have developed, is consumers looking to consume sometimes on a per capita basis less wine in many markets, but wanting to drink better wine. So as preferences have evolved and people have become more familiar with wine and comfortable with the product, so that's one thing. And then I think just generally there's been a lot of trends in the background, whether it's drink driving and just a lot of advice around alcohol consumption, and I think people just looking to moderate consumption to a certain extent, and that has kind of led to consumers looking to drink lighter styles of wine and more delicate styles of wine. So yeah, I think those confluence of factors has really helped the New Zealand wine industry along, and look, the industry's done very well in terms of promoting itself, organising itself, and maintaining a high standard of production.
We've had a great run in the US recently, and your report backs this up. I think we've just overtaken Australia in terms of the value of imports, and we're at about half the volume. I mean, look, that's an amazing position to be in. How is it that the US has more or less quite suddenly emerged to be in such a strong position for us as a marketplace?
Yeah, look, it is a remarkable feat, and I think it talks to just how fashionable wine is as a product, and how that needs to be considered. I think there's obviously the New Zealand story there, but I think there's also the Australian story that needs to be spoken to, which is one of the Australian industry leading with a lower value offering, more cheap and cheerful wines, and then cementing its position at that end of the market and struggling to get consumers to perceive them in any different light, even though Australia does have a very strong premium wine offering. So it all comes down to how you position yourself in the minds of consumers, and I think from the very beginning, New Zealand's been seen as very high quality wines, high price wines, and I think just the halo of the New Zealand brand, as we appreciate, is also very helpful. And what we've seen in that market over the last 5 to 6 years is what's known as a premiumisation trend, where consumers have gradually, as I said earlier in the discussion, looked to consume, and per capita consumption in the US is actually still rising, so it's not really that they're drinking better and less. In a lot of ways, that they're actually drinking better and in some cases more. So it's a very positive market from that perspective.
What are the drivers of consumption, by the way, in the US?
What we've seen over there is basically a market which is still adopting wine consumption and wine culture, a bit like we've seen in Australia and New Zealand, a decade or so ago. We're a little further down the track, but you're seeing very similar consumption trends as well, where we're just seeing changing preferences. And I view it in two ways. One is intragenerational changes in preferences, and then intergenerational changes in preferences. So it's the baby boomer generation that really were the first generation to adopt wine consumption and wine culture. So they're wanting to drink more interesting, different and higher quality products, and they got the money to pay for it. So we're seeing those changes push wine consumption into higher price brackets. But what we're also seeing as well is intergenerational changes. So the generations that are coming into the market, whether that's Generation X or Y and Z, the so-called millennials, they're entering their drinking life at a much different stage and level than their parents did. So they're much more familiar with wine and wine culture, and they're actually entering the market at a much higher and advanced level. So they're actually coming into the market saying, I want to drink for example, over here in Australia, they might say, I want to drink a $15, $20 bottle of wine, not a $5, $10 bottle of wine, or a cask for that matter. So I think those trends are very much alive and well over in the US.
Those same trends playing out in the UK. The UK has always supported a very strong pricing, particularly around New Zealand wine.
Yes, they are. And look, I think when you do look at the UK market, I think on a macro level, consumption is very stable. If not, it's been declining, just given what's been happening economically in that country over the last 5 or 10 years. And there's also been a lot of headwinds in terms of, this is pre-Brexit. Brexit's a whole other story, but there's been a lot of pressure from a tax perspective. Excise taxes have been ramped up in the UK, particularly on wine, quite aggressively. So that certainly hasn't helped. It's put a lot of pressure on wine consumption, which still, a large volume of consumption still obviously occurs at the bottom end of the market. But we do see quite positive trends even in the UK market at more premium levels, where you see consumers wanting to and willing to spend money on higher value wines, even though consumption on a whole, and particularly at the bottom end of the market, is languishing a little bit.
Big difference too, or big change, really, post the Brexit vote in terms of the pound value, certainly vis-a-vis New Zealand. If that stays where it is for the foreseeable future, can you picture that hurting New Zealand?
Oh, look, it's very worrying, not just for New Zealand, but for all wine producers who are focused on and continue to focus on the UK market. A 30% devaluation of the pound is very scary if it's prolonged, and it looks like it probably will be. I think the New Zealand category in the UK is very, very strong, though. I think consumers really do look to that, and so there is really a symbiotic relationship between retailers and I think the New Zealand wine category, where I think retailers know they need New Zealand wines in their stores. They just need to manage prices in their stores and obviously want to continue to offer the best value possible for their customers who will continue to buy and drive volume through their stores. But I think, New Zealand's offer is still very strong and unique in a lot of ways, that they still can command a place at the negotiating table. But yeah, you wouldn't want to push that too far, because we do know that these retailers can throw their weight around.
Still room for the smaller guy, mate?
It's getting more difficult. There's no doubt about that. I think wine producers all around the world, smaller wine producers, are looking where they can to go direct to the consumer more and more. And that's difficult for New Zealand wine producers because you've got such a small domestic market. I think wine companies are trying to find ways to access better distribution, but in a market like the UK, you really don't have much choice. And the trend we are seeing all around the world, whether it's the US or the UK or Australia, New Zealand, is a rationalisation in distribution. So you're seeing fewer bigger distributors typically as they look to address the balance in power with retailers as well, which in a lot of cases actually leaves smaller wine producers focusing very much on the on-premise restaurant, cafe trade, And what we're seeing, and you might have seen headlines, is big retailers like Tesco and Sainsbury really rationalising their SKUs or product lines and offerings in their supermarkets. So the same amount of space is dedicated to wine, but you've just got much fewer products and brands being offered in that space. So logic tells you that it tends to be the bigger, more well-known brands that tend to get those listings.
Look, Mark, we're going to have to leave it there. If somebody wants to pick up a copy of the quarterly report, where they grab that?
Our website, or please get in touch with me, marc.soccio@rabobank.com.
Perfect. Look, thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
This interview was brought to you in association with Rabobank.